it's just so clear now, Professor Jiang, what the playbook is, as you said. Where does Iran fit into this larger picture then? Because there is a situation that the United States is facing that even the mainstream media is talking about, which is the U.S. military cannot do everything at once. Talking about how the hotspots around the globe mean heightened risk that any retaliation succeeds, referencing Iran, but really talking about the whole world and how the U.S. military is indeed everywhere, Professor Jiang. And it just so happens that one of the main reasons why a strike didn't occur was because the Israelis supposedly said, we don't have enough air defenses rebuilt from the 12-day war provided to us again. And there aren't aircraft carriers here to support a long-term strike because a lot of them have been moved to the Caribbean or remain in the Pacific. So where does Iran ultimately fit? Because last time I checked, the national security strategy, Professor Jiang, said that the U.S. empire is supposed to be controlling the Western Hemisphere and moving out of this region. And yet here we are talking about Iran.
Right. So I think first and foremost, there's this misinterpretation of what the national security strategy says. Okay, I've read it. Nor does it say that America is going to retreat back into the Western Hemisphere and leave, Asia and Europe to other powers. Okay, create what I call spheres of influence. Nor does it say that. Okay, what the national security strategy says is, number one, that America will no longer abide by these liberal multilateral organizations like United Nations, which has hampered American power. Okay, so America just thinks that these organizations that basically justify the American empire are useless, and now it'll just be might is right. We will act unilaterally. We will act what will be in our best national self-interest. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that it states explicitly that the Western Hemisphere belongs to America. Okay, this is what's called the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine or the Donroe Doctrine. Okay, it states that very clearly. Number three is that it will strangle China economically. All right, so the idea is you can't fight China in Southeast Asia militarily. That'd be suicidal. You're fighting China on its home front. So what you do is you blockade China economically. Okay, so that means basically taking control of the Western Hemisphere and cutting off valuable resources to China, which includes oil, of course, but also includes lithium, copper, and silver, which are crucial for high tech. Okay, including solar panels, AI, EVs. Basically, you cannot have a high tech industry without these rare earth minerals and these other critical minerals. And most of these actually mineral supplies comes from the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so that's number one. But number two is that actually the United States will contest China in Africa as well. China is gaining a foothold in Africa, mainly because China is actually building up the infrastructure of Africa, and Africans like that. But what the Americans say is that, no, we will not surrender Africa to China. We will challenge China in Africa. Number three is the idea that from an American perspective, if you're an ally, all your resources, all your manpower, all your wealth belongs to America. It implies that in national security strategy, which means that essentially Japan is a vassal state to America. Both South Korea and Japan are vassal states. It also means that all these like billions of dollars that Japan has in U.S. Treasury holdings, it actually belongs to America. Okay, it's not Japanese. It doesn't belong to Japanese people. It belongs to America. So the national security strategy outlines how to maintain the American empire and how the American empire needs to transition from one focus on soft power, on building consensus, on multilateral organizations, to one of hard power, of actually using its military power to project forward by strengthening China, maintaining control over supply lines. And the other thing that national security strategy says that's very important is it basically gives up on Europe. It's saying that Europe strategically is not valuable to Europe, to the United States. Why? Because number one, it's an aging population, so they don't have much manpower. It doesn't have any resources. It's a welfare state dependent on American military protection. And the Europeans are too focused on DEI, too focused on world politics. And so the national security strategy calls for either the abandonment of Europe or the underminement of Western Europe in favoring the rise of right-wing regimes in Eastern Europe that will be much more amenable to American power, which include Poland, Hungary, Austria. Okay, so that's what the national security strategy says. And once we understand what the national security strategy says, then we understand what's going on in the world, why Trump is, doing what he's doing in the Caribbean, why he's doing what he's doing in Iran. A lot of it is to maintain the American empire, and a lot of it is to strangle China economically, to basically blockade China. So, China is blockaded on its eastern front by the first island chain. And that's why it doesn't really have blue water navy. And if Iran were to fall, then China would be blockaded on its western front as well. Okay, so a lot of it is geared towards China. I'm not saying this is the primary reason, but I'm saying that China is a consideration. So this is a strategy. The problem is that it's schizophrenic and it's confusing, because why are you sending a third of your naval assets to the Caribbean to fight, to bomb fishing vessels and to kidnap Maduro, and at the same time you are calling for regime change in Iran? From a military perspective, it's insane what America is doing. And a lot of people didn't believe that Trump would actually strike Iran because the naval assets weren't in place yet. They had to get the ships from the Korean all the way back to the Middle East. And if you keep on doing this, you're just going to exhaust the military. I mean, the military just can't move back and forth on a whim. It takes months of planning. It's extremely expensive. You're these soldiers, these sailors need rest. I mean, Trump is just going to exhaust the American military. Trump is not a planner. Look at it this way, okay? He had the most successful TV show for the longest time, The Apprentice. Okay, so he's very good at creating TV ratings. But at the same time, every business he touched, whether it's casinos, whether it's restaurants, he bankrupted. Okay, so this is a guy who's concerned first and foremost about optics. Doesn't really care about fundamentals, the fundamentals of business, the fundamentals of military. And that's why I think in 2026 it's just gonna be exhausting. Where we know what he's trying to do, but it doesn't make any military sense. Strategically, militarily, geopolitically, it's just idiotic. Why are you pissing off the Europeans, who are your allies? Why are you threatening the Canadians, who are your allies? Why are you, saying I'm going to go regime change in Iran when you don't actually have the military capacity to do so, and your generals tell you we can't do so? Why are you kidnapping Maduro, which is a direct insult to the sovereignty of the South Americans? So none of this makes sense, okay? But again, the problem is that Trump is first and foremost concerned about optics, looking like a great conquering hero. So he's interested in cheap, easy wins, okay? Such as, Maduro. Greenland will be a cheap, easy win for him. Then Cuba will probably be a cheap, easy win for him. He's not interested in these long, protracted conflicts that might backfire on him. But what he's doing is really delaying the inevitable, right? Because eventually you're going to have to go to war in Iran. And the further you spread yourself out, it's like what we'll call imperial overstretch, right? The weaker you're going to be in this, final boss fight with Iran, which is going to happen sooner or later. So what's happening in the world, it's just moronic.
Maybe we can game theory this imperial overstretch, because that's exactly what the Atlantic piece that I have here talks about. And, Professor Jiang, we talk about the U.S. military not being able to do everything in these hotspots. How does the entrance of a possible full-scale war with Iran now factor into this? How does it change this? Because it wasn't too long ago where we weren't really talking about, again, a full-scale war with Iran being imminent. And now there's a lot of momentum, a lot of pressure into doing so. But we have talked about the Venezuela situation here, the kidnapping operation, which hasn't led to full regime change and has angered Venezuelans. They are in the streets every single day showing how angry they are about that. There is a large military presence, naval presence in the Caribbean that is very expensive and doesn't really seem sustainable. And then, as you have pointed out, if isolating China and maybe to an extent Russia. But if we look at China, all of these flashpoints from Greenland to Venezuela to Iran, if the Trump administration only optically succeeds, from my underestimation, China isn't really interested in optics. They're interested in actually doing business and getting things done. Seems like these operations that so focus on optics could actually serve the opposite purpose, which is to isolate the U.S. more. What do you think? Is the U.S. going to become more isolated, the empire, in 2026?
So I think like the best historical analogy for what's happening today is the Peloponnesian War. It's a book written by Thucydides, who was this Athenian general who was trying to analyze this 30-year war between Sparta and Athens that really destroyed the Athenian Empire. He goes on and lists the mistakes that the Athenian Empire made in order to doom itself. And it's the same mistakes that the Americans are making as well, okay? So after the Persian Wars, Athens came across as a savior of the Greek diaspora, okay, across the Aegean. And so it's very similar to, how after World War II, the Europeans thanked America for saving Europe from fascism. But the fear among the Europeans is that the Americans would abandon Europe like they did after World War I. So they created NATO. And the idea of NATO was to ensure that America would always have a military presence in Europe and defend Europe against the Soviet Union. And and you could argue that as part of this deal, they created something called the Bretton Woods agreement. Okay, and the idea of the Bretton Woods agreement is that the U.S. dollar would become the global reserve currency to facilitate global trade, and to ensure that the Americans would not abuse this exorbitant privilege, the U.S. dollar would be pegged to gold. Okay, so that was the agreement after World War II. Problem is, 1971, America was bankrupt. Okay, America had spent billions on funding this pointless war in Vietnam. America was funding the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which was a great program for Americans, but which was also bankrupting America as well. America had spent billions on the space race as well, sending a man to the moon. So by 1971, America was bankrupt. So Nixon basically said, you know what? I know we promised to pay everyone back in gold in exchange for US dollars, but you know what? Forget that. Where US dollar will not be pegged to anything. Okay, so too bad. Just imagine US dollars as a tax you pay in order to be free. Okay, and after the Soviet Union fell, everyone had no choice but to buy into the system, right? And this created over-financialization in the US economy. It allowed the rich to get richer and the poor to remain poor. And then basically America became very lazy and shifted its manufacturing to China. And because of all this, we are in a situation where we are today, where basically America is living off rent it collects from the rest of the world. It basically colonizes the entire world. And the mechanism it's able to do this is, of course, through the US dollar. And this hasn't worked fine until 2022, when Putin invaded Ukraine and showed that he's willing to challenge American hegemony. But not only that, but the Americans used their financial system. They weaponized the financial system in order to sanction Russia. And the classic example, of course, is SWIFT. It's SWIFT. It basically knocked Russia off SWIFT, and it sanctioned Russia. But it failed, and it showed that the U.S. financial system isn't as powerful as you imagine. The other thing that America did, which is really stupid, was it basically seized $200 billion in Russian assets. So this is money that the Russian central bank had stored in Europe and America, and basically America said, nope, it belongs. You can't touch it anymore. Okay, and this caused massive panic around the world, because if you put your money into America, you do so because you think it's protected by law, and if America can just seize your money for any reason, then people are not willing to put their money into America anymore. So this caused the Japanese, the Chinese, basically everyone to start buying more gold and in exchange their U.S. treasuries for gold. So basically, another way of saying this is that America is this corrupt empire that insists on collecting rent from everyone. People are sick of paying this extortion, and they're rebelling against this. And so America is using force. Okay, and this is the same thing that the Athenians did back in the Peloponnesian War, and it turned these allies into vassal states, and eventually into enemies as well. And that's what we're seeing happening in Europe today, where these former vassal states have come to see that America is actually a real threat to their peace and prosperity, not Russia. But the other thing that's really interesting about all this, and it's really interesting, okay, is that while this is happening, while America is fighting these while the Athenians are fighting these stupid wars overseas, the Athenians also engaged in a civil war, okay? And the reason why is you have this massive oligarchy that comes into being due to all the corruption. And this oligarchy creates, like they are fighting amongst themselves for status. And we're actually seeing the same situation in America, where if you think about it, what's happening in Washington is actually a civil war between the deep state establishment, that's financial, right, which is Wall Street, and they came to power through the Clinton or Obama years. Now, what Trump represents is the sort of like the new money, it's Silicon Valley, AI, surveillance state elite, okay, as embodied in the people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, right, Sam Altman, Palantir, okay. So that's the conflict that's happening, and I think that a lot of this domestic conflict in America, it's driven by this deeper divide within the oligarchy. So this pattern we've seen before, okay, and it leads ultimately what? It leads ultimately to one, revolution in Athens. It leads to two, the entire world unifying against Athens, and three, it ultimately leads to the defeat of Athens. So I think a similar pattern will play out today, where there's a civil war or revolution in America, where the entire world unifies against America because they see America as the greatest threat to world peace. Number three is that this will lead ultimately to the demise of the American empire.
We already have two flashpoints in 2026 that have already exploded in many ways. We have Venezuela and then Iran. And Iran is not done. Neither is Venezuela, which, from my estimation, Professor Jiang, the Trump administration essentially conducted a kidnapping operation, left the same government in power, and has now millions upon millions of people who support the current government in Venezuela very angry that their leader was taken from them. And in a context of a regional situation, which I've said this on the show, Professor John, the regional situation in Latin America and South America was not necessarily unfavorable to the United States before this. And I know that you have opinions on where that's going to go. So in terms of the future of the American empire, this is a major focus now between Iran and Venezuela. How do these two contexts then, kind of build the future of the American empire, or lay the foundations for the future of the American empire in 2026?
Okay, well, let's give Trump the benefit of the doubt, okay? And let's say, like, there's actually a strategy here. And like, the end game, of course, is Iran, okay? America has to go invade Iran at some point. Now, if you invade Iran, there's a huge problem because Iran's going to cut off the Strait of Hormuz, and it's going to collapse the East Asian economies of South Korea, Japan, China. China depends on 50% of its oil imports from the Middle East. So if there's a war going on, and this war could last for years and years, right? How do you compensate for the fact that these Southeast Asian economies, their economy is going to collapse, and they'll be dragged into the war as well? Well, okay, you can use Venezuela and North America, United States, Canada, to compensate for the loss of oil in the Middle East, right? So that's why you need to secure Venezuela, because you're anticipating this massive conflict in the Middle East. And so you need to modernize the Venezuelan oil industry in order to ensure that these East Asian economies don't implode and they're not dragged into the war, especially Japan and China and South Korea. So that's the strategy, okay? The problem with this is that you assume that the people of Venezuela are just going to sit back and let you steal their oil and resources and let them allow for Trump to impose a government, a regime that will only obey the Americans. Some Americans have a long memory of much despised Yankee imperialism, right? Thousands, tens of thousands of people were killed by these military juntas controlled by the CIA, right? So Chile is a classic example where the democratically elected government led by Allende was overthrown by General Pinochet, who was backed by Kissinger and the CIA. So some Americans do not like American interference. So what this is going to do, even though it may make long-term strategic sense, it's going to piss off the South American people. It's going to rally the Venezuelan people. Eventually in Venezuela, in a few months' time, you're going to have a general election. And this general election will be heavily contested, and America will be forced to send boots on the ground in order to maintain stability in Caracas. And then this will initiate a guerrilla warfare. So I understand, like, geopolitically, it does make sense what's happening in Venezuela, right? But the way that it's being handled is that eventually you have mission creep, and eventually you'll lead to a situation like Vietnam, and it's going to exhaust the American empire. So another thing saying this is in the short term, in a 2-year time frame, all this makes sense, and Americans will feel that Trump has control, and Trump is like this great conquering hero who will make America great again. In the long term, America is going to suffer tremendous blowback, not only in Venezuela, but throughout the Caribbean and throughout Latin and South America. So it's really the end of empire. Listen, the Americans could have done this at any point, okay? In fact, even like in one day, America could just go and topple every regime in South America. They have that military capacity. You don't do that because it's retarded, because it's suicidal, because you just piss off people. You're pissing off hundreds of millions of people. You're unifying them. You're giving them a reason to fight against you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you said there's a long history, Professor Jiang, of this kind of behavior pissing off people in South America, Latin America, the Caribbean. Now, the Trump administration in the United States, they're not ones to hide, and I think this is a big problem for the American empire. They're not ones to hide how exactly they want to do things. And we've heard repeatedly from the Trump administration with regard to Iran, for example, and now Venezuela too, that they want quick, decisive blows. So they want to kind of have their cake and eat it too. How do you see this playing out now in the rest of 2026? Because if the Trump administration is going to try to move in with overwhelming force or sneak attacks or kidnapping operations, coups, this sort of thing, those have a high risk of not succeeding, as we have now seen twice already in the first month of 2026. What does this do then or how does this portend for the rest of even just this year, given that the Trump administration, they want quick, decisive blows? Sounds like they're going to try to land more than a few in the upcoming weeks and months to come.
So that's exactly Trump's mentality, where he wants quick victories in order to create the optic that he's Julius Caesar, that he's this great conquering hero who will restore the American empire to its greatness. And quite honestly, most Americans actually support his imperial ambitions. I mean, that's just reality on the ground. Polls may say something different, but in their hearts, most Americans aspire to an imperial greatness. It's just human nature. So the reality, though, is that Iran's not going to fall. I mean, yes, it looks unstable. It's been economically depressed because of American sanctions for decades. But the mullahs are much more resilient, much more resourceful, much more creative than Americans give them credit for. So Iran's not going to fall. So what's going to happen is that Trump's going to get frustrated with the situation in Iran and shift his focus elsewhere, which includes Greenland, right? Greenland isn't quick, easy victory because there's actually nothing the Europeans can do about this. If Trump just says, "Listen, I'm going to annex Greenland," no one can stop him. The Germans and the French and the Swedes and the Norwegians are like, we will militarily defend Greenland. So what do? Well, Germany sent 15 soldiers to Greenland. The French sent 13 soldiers to Greenland. Guess what? There's already 150 American troops in Greenland already. So the idea that the Europeans can actually resist this American annexation of Greenland is just retarded, okay? So that's a quick victory. Another quick victory for Trump would be Canada, okay? So the Canadian housing market has collapsed. There's going to be massive layoffs this year. And you'll have certain areas like Alberta is the most obvious example. That's going to vote to succeed from Canada. And then maybe 20% of Albertans who vote to actually join the United States, okay? But Trump doesn't care. For him, it's like 100%, right? 20% equals 100% in his worldview. And he's going to threaten Canada and say, so like, you either give us Alberta or we're going to come and invade you. And this is going to create a lot of TV drama, which is what Trump thrives on, okay? So that's also another quick, easy victory for Trump, Alberta, okay? And then another quick, easy victory is Cuba. Because what's happening is that Cuba's energy lifeline is Venezuela. Without Venezuela, basically Cuba goes dark. It cannot have electricity. Okay, so Cuba will also be another quick, easy victory. Then I think these are the three easiest right now, and then eventually you'll build up, because the problem with these quick, easy victories is it creates hubris. It creates the it makes you self-delusional and believe that you are invincible. Okay, but I think that Iran will be much more resilient than Trump believes, and he'll get frustrated and move on somewhere else.